All right, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about this principle of occlusal equilibration. So what we're trying to get after is to turn a clinical situation that you see here into something that looks more like this. And this is more reflective of this idea of our mutually protected occlusion. Right, so what we're after is a occlusion where you have contact points that are equally distributed. So contact points of equal intensity amongst anterior and posterior teeth. So remember, what we're looking for is contact on the posterior teeth that act as a protective factor as to not overload the anterior teeth. So if we go back to this initial scenario that we first see, we can see that there's only contact points on 2 of these teeth. So even though they're on posterior teeth that are designed to be able to withstand a lot of these forces, we know that this is a situation that is probably going to undergo some sort of primary occlusal trauma where there's excessive forces on these 2 teeth because all of the masticatory forces is concentrated on just these 2 teeth. So a better scenario is going to be something like this, where the forces can be evenly distributed amongst all teeth. Okay, so the question is, how do we get to this point, and where should the contacts ideally be touching on the corresponding arches? All right. So let's jump into this and just first determine where the contact point should ideally be in this mutually protected occlusion. So let's visit this idea where the buccal cusps are the functional cusps for mandibular teeth. All right, so if we were to just trace where these contact points are, so let's take a look at these, the functional cusps of the mandibular teeth, and we just outline and trace out where they contact with the corresponding maxillary teeth. So let's put this into words here, and we're going to say that the most mesial buccal cusp of the mandibular tooth will always occlude with the mesial marginal ridge of its corresponding maxillary tooth. Okay, so as an example, we're going to trace this tooth here, which is the buccal cusp of the mandibular first premolar, and if we were to trace this out, it's going to occlude with the mesial marginal ridge of the corresponding maxillary tooth. So if you have your typodonts and you want to kind of map this out and kind of trace it out, you can start to close that and simulate that movement so that you can see exactly where they hit. Okay, so you want to visualize that in real life. Sometimes it's hard to kind of see how these hinge together on a PowerPoint. So as we move along, we can see that the buccal cusp of the mandibular first molar will occlude with the mesial marginal ridge of its corresponding maxillary first molar. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. A little caveat to this is going to be, obviously your molars have 2 cusps, so if we go to the distal cusp of this mandibular molar, well, where's that going to hit? Well, it's going to hit now in the central groove of its corresponding tooth. Okay, so if we're to reverse this and now look at the maxillary arch, we know that the maxillary arch, their functional cusp is going to be the lingual cusp. Okay, so if we're going to map these out, we can see that they are going to hit on a different location. So let's run through these examples. So now we're going to trace through the lingual cusp of a maxillary first molar is going to occlude on the distal marginal ridge of the mandibular first premolar. So as a general rule of thumb, we're going to say that the most distal lingual cusp is going to occlude with the distal marginal ridge of its corresponding mandibular tooth. Okay, so we can run through all of these points, and of course when we get to the molar, we're going to find that it has a second functional cusp. So now if we look at all of the distal lingual cusps of the maxillary tooth, well, these are going to interdigitate with the distal marginal ridge of that mandibular first molar or the corresponding mandibular tooth. Okay, and then the mesial lingual cusp is going to hit in the central groove. So basically I don't need you to exactly memorize all these things, but the more that you do this equilibration exercise, this will get to a point where you don't really have to think about where these are. You're just going to be able to visualize where they ideally interdigitate. So after a few rounds of this equilibration, this should come fairly naturally to you. So another principle that I want to highlight is this idea that cusp tips don't always necessarily interdigitate perfectly with its corresponding fossa or marginal ridge. Right? So if we look at this picture here, we can see that the contact point isn't actually at the cusp tip and in the central groove, but rather it's on the inclines of these teeth. So if we have that situation where we form a tripodized contact, where we have 3 points, well, these can function as a stable holding cusp. So even though these contacts occur on cusp inclines, they form a stable tripod and they function to stabilize the tooth. So if you want a different visual for what this kind of looks like, it's this idea that pretend that your cusp tip is like a Sharpie. So instead of having that cusp tip or the point of it being able to form a dot right in the center, sometimes that cusp tip is too wide and it's going to hit all 3 sides of this tooth, but it's going to form a tripod, so it's pretty stable. All right, so we're going to consider that these 3 points as a contacting unit instead of just a contacting point, but it sort of serves the same function when we look at the number of contacts and location. So these tripodized contacts kind of result in the same function in that they direct the force along the long axis of the tooth. What we don't want to see is contacts on inclines that don't have tripodized contacts. So this is sort of analogous as if like you had a nail and you had a hammer and then you're hammering this nail, but it's just a little bit off axis. As you can see from this diagram, when you first hit the tooth, it's not stable and it's going to want to shift or move the tooth and cause a unstable occlusion. Okay, so one of the purposes of this occlusal equilibration is to try to convert something that is not in an ideal occlusal scheme into something that looks a little bit more like this, where we have a equally distributed contact points to form this mutually protected occlusion. Okay, so let's run through some of the goals of what we're trying to do here as we develop a stable occlusion. So what we're trying to get after really is if you were to take your typodonts and just hand articulate them or put them together, when they first come from the manufacturer, you'll find that they come with a little bit of a rock. And what we're trying to get after is to be able to stabilize that, so you just get one solid maximum intercuspation position that doesn't really move around much. Okay, so as we go through this equilibration, we're going to get more and more points contacting each other, and it's going to find the stable bite that will repeatedly get back to and minimize any rock there. Okay, so we're point number 2, we're going to say that we want no anterior, posterior, or medial lateral rock. A couple of the other criteria that we want is to see 5 bilateral contacting units, 3 of which on the molars and 2 on the premolar. So by contacting unit, I am referring to not just each individual dot, but for example, this cusp tip hitting this marginal ridge will count as a contacting unit. Okay, and in the anterior, we want a minimum of 3 of these contacts, 1 on each canine, and then just another one on an incisor. So any of the other 4. Okay. And then the last 2 points talk about what we want to see in a lateral and a protrusive movement. The thing about these typodonts is that they're kind of already built in canine guidance and a good protrusive separation of your posterior teeth. So we generally don't have to worry about making adjustments to achieve the last 2 principles there. Okay, so in order to visualize that, point 5 is the idea of canine guidance. So as you move your articulator from side to side, you want to see that the canines separate the back teeth, and you want to see space between them. And then similarly, when you slide your jaw straight forward on your articulator, you're going to see that the anterior teeth end up separating the back teeth. So in order to do this, you're going to have to loosen the knobs on the sides of your fixed type-it-on articulators to allow for this motion to happen. So if you were to mark it, you would see lines when you go in lateral, and then straight lines going forward when you see a protrusive movement. Okay, so an ideal occlusal scheme, again, you want to see dots where you have the maximum intercuspation points. So when we're just biting up and down, you should mark in all these little dots. But when the jaw moves from side to side or forward, you're going to see lines. Okay. So now let's go through the principles of adjusting these contacts, or what steps we actually have to take to know which marks to adjust. So we have these 4 listed here, and we'll take it one by one here. So the first step that you want to do, or the first principle you want to look at, is whenever you mark with articulating paper where the contacts are, just go ahead and mentally line up or match up the points that correspond to each other. So when your first round of equilibration, it'll be fairly straightforward because there's not many dots to line up. So it's pretty obvious that this large mark here forms a corresponding mark with this one here. And if you look at this tripodized mark, you can see that these 3 dots here end up contacting these 3 here. So we'll say that this functioning contacting unit corresponds with this one. The next principle that we're looking at is this idea that we always want to deepen the corresponding fossa, and we never want to shorten a functional cusp. So one way to visualize it is just imagine if you just kind of divide this tooth in half, and then we're going to say there's a functional region and a non-functional region. And we can follow what we call this bull rule. So bull stands for buccal of the upper and then lower lingual. These correspond to areas in which it is safe to adjust because these are non-functional areas. So just visually, if you look at it, if we were looking at corresponding points or contacts, all we have to do is ask, well, which one is a non-functional area? And that's going to be the one that you're going to adjust. So conversely, when we look at this premolar, we can see that these contacting units are in a functional area, so we're probably not going to adjust any of these. However, when we look at the corresponding contacting unit, we can see that the majority of these contacts are in non-functional areas. So it's these 3 points that we want to deepen the corresponding fossa. So in summary, we're going to stay away from functional cusps. So this would be the lingual of the maxillary teeth, and then the buccal of the mandibular teeth. But rather, you adjust or deepen the non-functional area, and you can follow the bull rule as a reminder to tell you where to adjust. So the third principle that we're talking about here is whenever you have a contact that occurs on the incline of a ridge here, you don't really want to take a burr and just go ahead and flatten that out. Okay. So rather what this principle is talking about is you want to come from the mesial and distal of that contact point and then try to maintain the anatomic form of that incline. So instead of taking your burr and just wiping that straight flat, you want to adjust the mesial and distal slopes here. So this maintains the ridge's anatomic form. Okay. Alright, so principle number 4, when we get to the anterior teeth, we're going to have contact between the mandibular incisal edge with the lingual surface of the maxillary anterior teeth. So the question is, well, which of the 2 should we adjust? And what's going to inform our decision is we want to balance this idea of, or maintain this idea of phonetics, aesthetics, and incising ability. So if you think about phonetics, if we were to shorten this incisal edge, that can start to affect the way that we pronounce words. So when you go make an S sound, what happens is that your anterior teeth create just a small little gap, just enough for that sound, the S sound, to escape through the teeth. So if you were to count, for example, from 60 to 69, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, you can hear that there's a little bit of air that escapes. So if you start hacking down the incisal edge of these mandibulars too much, well, that space is going to get large enough where you're going to start to get a lisp. Okay? So based on that principle, we want to adjust the lingual of the maxillary anterior teeth. Okay? So that won't affect that closest speaking space, as we call it. Another reason is aesthetics. So when you adjust the lingual of the upper teeth, obviously that doesn't show people, it's not visible to anybody, so you're pretty safe adjusting that. Whereas if you adjust the lower mandibulars, those teeth height gets shorter and shorter and may look not as natural, or may have a worn down look to them. And then the last part is incising ability. So our incisors function to kind of tear food. So you can imagine the incisal edge contacting the incisal edge of the uppers. Well, you want to maintain that incising ability. So if we grind these down and flatten these out too much, we're going to lose the sharpness of those edges, and it's going to be harder for us to tear into that food. So based on all those reasons, phonetics, aesthetics, and incising ability, the preference is to adjust the lingual of the maxillary anterior teeth when you see corresponding contact points. All right, so let's run through a full example of this equilibration exercise. So just to get us oriented, we have the maxillary arch and the mandibular, and then we can split this up into buccal and lingual. But really what's probably a better way to visualize this is to label these as functional and non-functional, because remember, this is going to inform us into which side of the teeth that we're going to adjust. Okay. So in the red, this is the functional area. This is sort of our no-go zone. These are areas that we'd rather not adjust or shorten the cusp tips here. All right. And then the green signifies that these are non-functional areas, or the bull rule. So just a point of clarification, it's not a distinct exact line that we draw. So sometimes you are going to have contacting points that are going to end up being adjusted, that line, this red area, but really the points that we're trying to stay away from are the functional cusp tips. There are times where you do end up adjusting the inclines of these areas here. Okay, so it's not a defined line that we just draw in half, but you want to reason through whether it's reasonable to adjust an incline of a functional cusp. Alright, so we're going to follow our principles here of knowing which teeth to adjust. So we start off by marking with articulating paper, and the first go around you'll probably have a minimal number of contacting points. So like we went through in the earlier example, we're going to match up corresponding points. So it's pretty obvious here. These points line up, as well as these tripodized contacts. And then we go through and see which is our non-functional areas. Those are the areas that we're going to deepen. Okay, so this point here, and then these contacts here, we're going to adjust those away with our red stripe football burr. Okay, so use the red stripe. It's less coarse than that green one that you have in your prosket. We just need to make minor adjustments to these to get our equilibration done. So as we adjust, those will disappear. And then what we're going to do is then go back and then remark our points. So with articulating paper, we can now see that more of these points have, or more of these teeth have come into contact with each other. Okay. So again, we go through the same principle. We're going to line up or find corresponding points. So these go together. These are the same ones from last time. We have our tripodized contacts. And then we've picked up a few new spots here. So these functional cusps here on the mandibular premolars have found their corresponding teeth. As well as a canine, you can see that we've picked up a spot. Okay. So we go ahead and mark, and in our heads find our pairs, and then we're going to visualize where our functional and non-functional areas are. So these are our functional cusp tips, so we're going to stay away from adjusting these. And our non-functional areas, these are the areas that we're going to deepen. Okay. And like we said before, this is going to be the maxillary lingual. We're going to adjust this area as opposed to the incisal edge because of phonetics, aesthetics, and incising ability. Okay. So those get adjusted away, and you can see that our functional cusp tips are left alone, and then we're going to go ahead and remark. And now you can see even more contacts starting to appear. Okay. So we go ahead and again go through the same principles. So it's just rinse and repeat. We're lining up contact points. You can see a new one forming here. This is a functional cusp hitting a non-functional area. So this is really close to that central groove. So obviously this is the one that we're going to leave alone because that's a functional area, and we'd rather deepen that area. So you'll go through the remaining teeth and kind of match them up and go through that same principle or exercise. So this is a functional area. We'd rather deepen this. This is a functional cusp tip. We're going to deepen this. So as a visual, this is helpful to do, where you can kind of visualize where that buccal of the upper and lower lingual, or the bull rule. Right? So we go through that and we'll adjust those areas down, and then we go through a new round of marking the occlusion again. Okay, so you can see now in this third molar we finally picked up a few more points here. Okay, so maybe we'll go through one more cycle where we make an adjustment, and at this point now we've got a majority of our contact points. There should be 3 contacting points in the anterior, 2 of which should be on the canines, and you're going to want 1 on the remaining 4 incisors at a minimum. In the posterior teeth, we're looking for 5 contacting units, hopefully 3 on the molar teeth, and then at least 2 on the premolar. So in our situation here, we've got more than we need. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we have close to 7 contacting units. So that fulfills our principles of equilibration. So at this point, we can probably stop. And when we take the typodonts out, and if you were to hand articulate, meaning if you just take the 2 articulators and with your hands mesh them together, we're going to find that that forms a stable bite, meaning if you try to move it around, it's pretty socked in. You're not going to get any tipping or fulcruming anywhere. It's going to form a stable occlusion. Okay. If that's not occurring, and if you can feel a lot of movement, then we know we got to go back and we probably need to pick up more contacting points to form that stable occlusion. All right. So again, this diagram is just showing half of your typodont. Obviously, when you do it in the sim clinic, you're going to look at the whole entire arch. You're not just going to do half at a time. This is just easier for us to visualize in our lecture format here. So now I want to go through a few frequently asked questions that you guys are going to encounter. And I want to walk through these so that you will be able to independently guide yourself in knowing where to adjust. So a scenario that may occur is if you have both functional cusps are contacting each other. So this is our maxillary tooth, and then this is our lingual cusp, so that's our functional one, and then our mandibular cusp is our functional cusp of the mandibular tooth is the buccal cusp. So you can see that the inclines of both cusps are touching each other. So what do we do when both of these are functional cusp areas? Okay. Well, in this case, since they're both kind of equivalent to each other, just pick one of the areas to adjust. It kind of doesn't matter. So either cusp incline is okay to adjust. Right? So that's that principle there. Another scenario you may run into is, or notice, is that when you adjust your tooth, the location or the number of contacts have changed after I adjust them. So is this okay? So the example that we may have is pretend that this tooth here makes a contacting point on this incline. Well, you go ahead and you deepen that fossa, and then the next time you go to mark, obviously that tooth is now going to sit just a little bit differently. So now you're going to pick up a few more contact points, and that contact that was originally here may end up moving to a different location. So it's perfectly normal to see contacting points move, disappear, reappear. Okay. Again, the goal is to gain the number of contacts to form a stable occlusion. So go back to your criteria and count to see if you have fulfilled the guidelines that we're looking for to complete your equilibration procedure. Okay, so the number and location of contacts have changed after occlusal adjustment, and this is normal. Okay, something that students tend to struggle with is just kind of visualizing and understanding what we're trying to accomplish here, right? So why do we need to adjust the existing contact points in order to gain more points of contact? So we're going to kind of go through this example here. So just pretend we have 5 teeth that end up, we're trying to get all of them to touch together. Okay, so initially when you close the articulator down, you can see that the first and fourth tooth actually come in contact, but there's space between the other 3 teeth. So when we mark it with the paper, we're going to find contacting points on these teeth here. Okay, so what we end up doing is we're going to find, we're going to adjust those contacting points so that we're in hopes of getting other teeth to touch too. So just for now, just ignore the fact that we've adjusted the cusp tips. I know that's not what we have you do, but just for the sake of visualization of this example, it's just easier to kind of knock these off. Okay, but the principle is you're going to adjust those functioning or those contacting units so that when you mark it with articulating paper again, we can see that now we have 3 points of contact that are touching now because we've shortened these 2 contacting units. Okay, so now when we mark with articulating paper again, now we're going to have 3 points, and the goal is to sort of go through several iterations of this process so that eventually the rest of these teeth come into contact. So if we were to just mistakenly only adjust the 2 out of the 3 contact points, well, anytime we check the occlusion, this is going to be the only tooth that marks, and none of these teeth are going to be contacting because this was not adjusted. It's basically holding the bite up. All right, so whenever you see a situation like this, you really kind of have to adjust all the corresponding contacting points so that the whole jaw can get lowered so that these teeth that aren't touching will eventually get closer and closer to its opposing tooth. All right, so we're going to need to adjust all the teeth, and then the next time we close the teeth down, then now we're going to have the 4th tooth now come in contact. Okay, so this will get repeated until that 5th one will touch, or until you've fulfilled all the criteria in our guidelines, and that's when you know you're done with that exercise. So something that might happen is you may end up losing a contact point during your equilibration exercise. So let's take a look at the example, and we'll see what may lead us to that scenario. So here we have 1, 2, 3 of these teeth are in contact, and then we know, okay, we have to shorten these teeth in hopes of getting the other teeth closer to each other so they eventually will come in contact. But sometimes in doing so, we end up over adjusting a tooth. So when we grind a little bit more than we need to, obviously the next time we check and close the teeth together, well, now you're only going to get these teeth touching. We're not going to have this tooth have a contact point, even though previously we did, because we've adjusted too much. Okay, so it's going to take some experience to know how much tooth to grind. There's not a great science. It's hard to measure, how many microns of tooth structure you're removing, but it's good to start or to use the red stripe football diamond, because that will take just a little bit of tooth structure off. It's not a very aggressive burr. So once you get the feel of getting these contact points, you'll have a better idea over the course of the class as to how to quickly equilibrate these and not over adjust. All right, so the last question that we're going to go over is some of you may end up losing their posterior contacts pretty easily. So I want to go through this scenario, and we're going to focus just on a anterior contact and a posterior contact. So we'll kind of ignore the ones in the middle just so we can paint a picture of the extremes for now. Okay, so pretend that we have a posterior tooth touching and an anterior tooth touching at the same time when you close the articulator together. Okay. What ends up happening is if you end up adjusting the anterior and posterior tooth the same amount, you are actually going to have a discrepancy between the contact after you try to close the articulator again. Okay, because what we know is that the teeth, or our teeth, they hinge around our condyles. It's not a straight up and down movement, but rather there's a rotational component that rotates the teeth together. So what happens is if you adjust exactly the same amount in the anterior and posterior, as the jaw rotates, you're going to get the anterior teeth to touch first before the posterior tooth does. Okay? So this principle can be illustrated here. You can see that as we prop open the back tooth here a certain distance, as you measure this distance, or this opening in the anterior, you can see that the opening is much larger than it is in the back. And the reason again is because our jaw moves around a hinge. It doesn't just go up and down like an elevator. Okay. So based on this principle, a small amount of adjustment on the posterior teeth will quickly close the space in the anterior. So let's go back here and we can visualize this idea that when you adjust the same amount, you're going to have a opening in the back. So if we were to go back and sort of ideally adjust this, what we can see is that the posterior tooth needs less adjustment relative to the anterior tooth. Okay, so based on this line, you can see that the difference between the amount of adjustment needed, so that when they close together, you're going to have both of the teeth contacting at the same time. So just remember that principle, that when we close, it's on a hinge, so there's going to be a difference between how much you adjust in the posterior and the difference that you adjust in the anterior. Alright, so let's just finish up these learning objectives. So you want to be able to identify which occlusal marks to adjust, understand the ideal marks for static and dynamic occlusion. I want you to understand how the hinge axis influences the amount of adjustment needed, and then also the idea of tripartization and its role in stable occlusion.